I promised you that we had a number of amazing sessions coming up throughout today's summit, and we're kicking off with the first of those now. The session has the title, Building Workplaces of the Future and What Will This Look Like? I'd like to again point out that this session is being supported by the FDA. And we have a number of speakers joining us for this session. We're going to dig into the workplace of the future, try and understand what that might look like, because all of us are in workplaces of one kind or another. And we have a rough idea of what those workplaces have been like to date, what they feel like now, but how much time do we spend considering what those workplaces of the future will look like? And to give you a little bit of kind of perspective on this, I think there's a statistic floating around that says that something like 80% of the jobs that ever existed have disappeared, and they disappear about every couple of decades. Now, I may have got those stats quite slightly wrong, but the real figures don't really matter. What the underlying message is that workplaces change far more than we realize. Roles come and go. I mean, when was the last time you saw an organization that had a typing pool? Yeah. When did you last hear the clack of a manual typewriter or even an electric one? And so we don't tend to have typists anymore, do we? And that's just one tiny trivial example. So we've got a number of areas we're going to explore, including what does the future of the office space look like, and why this will be an imperative to attract and retain talent. I mean, I don't need to tell you that under lockdown, under COVID, the physical workspace and the use of offices has changed dramatically. We'll look at why pioneering new employment models and flexible employment will create adaptability. And we'll have a look at what agile working means and what methodologies we can embrace to ensure we get the best from our people. So to explore these, I'm really delighted to be joined by Lucille Thirlby and Neil Ryder from the FDA, by Baroness Usha Prashar, who is a member of the House of Lords. And just to give you some context about our wonderful panelists, so Neil is the head of FDA, and we're also joined by Will Serle from Capita. So Neil's the head of FDA and Learn and Key Skills, which is the FDA's professional development programs. He's been helping FDA members meet their professional development goals and build their skills since 2008. He's a trained trainer for civil service success profiles, delivering training across government departments, and previously chaired the highly successful Unlocking the SCS conferences, and is joined by his colleague Lucille, who is Assistant General Secretary of the FDA. So welcome to Neil and Lucille. Will joined Capita in 2018 as Chief People Officer, which is a new role created to devise and deliver the people strategy, which drives Capita's wider business strategy and ways of working for its employees. Will has more than 20 years of global HR experience, predominantly in the oil and gas sector. And prior to joining Capita, Will was Chief People Officer for AMEC Foster Wheeler, a global engineering organization. And Baroness Prashar is a crossbench member of the House of Lords. Since the 1970s, she served as director or chair of a variety of public and private sector organizations, and she became the first chair of the Judicial Appointments Commission upon its creation in April 2006. And of particular interest to today's summit, she's the former first Civil Service Commissioner. So welcome to all of you, and I'd like to kick off this discussion starting with Baroness Prashar. So Usha, you've been advising Nationwide and Sky on diversity and inclusion, and we wondered whether perhaps there were any insights from your experience in the in the private sector that could be shared across to the public sector.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction and your own introductory comments in setting the scene. I think from the point of view of inclusion and diversity, I think that the last 2 years and the COVID episode has actually thrown a very sharp spotlight in terms of what the workplaces will be. As you said in the introduction, workplaces have been changing, but I think, the COVID was a big jolt in terms of really people rethinking what the workplace is. And of course, it led to people working from home and so on. And I think it actually provides an opportunity for us to think, what should a workplace be like? And, how many times do people need to come in or can work from home? And I think it has provided for us to explore new opportunities, because at one level, I think home working means you can cast your net wider in terms of where you recruit people from. And that can have positive implications for diversity, whether you have disability or you are a woman wanting to work from home, or if travel is an issue. So I think in that sense, it actually, widens the actual net from where you can draw people. The other thing really is it has empowered workers and it's given flexibility. And I think from that point of view, it is actually a good thing. But having said that, I think in developing your workplaces, you've got to look at of the downside, because if you're working from home, how are you going to make sure that people develop a sense of belonging and inclusion in the institutions they are working in? Will they actually understand the culture of the organization and so on? So the challenges really are, how are you going to manage the hybrid working situation? And how are you going to ensure that while it gives you opportunities, that people who are working outside don't feel actually excluded? The other dimension I think we've got to take into account is that coming into the office, the kind of the ad hoc conversations that place, spark of ideas, will that actually impact on innovation? Because isolation can have an impact on your mental health. So how this is going to pan out obviously remains to be seen. But I think it's a good opportunity for us to begin to think, how are we going to manage hybrid working, taking into account, what are the downsides and the upsides, and also making sure that we look at it through the lenses of inclusion and diversity. And of course, in this context, inclusion has taken a much wider meaning for me, because it doesn't necessarily mean in terms of gender, race, or whatever. It's really people who are working from home or working at the office. How are you going to develop the sense of inclusion? So those are the challenges. And if I may throw another dimension here, which is that how is artificial intelligence going to have an impact on how the workplace will actually develop? I mean, that I think we can come back to, but those are the few things I'd just like to put on the table for starters.
And I think the thing you've highlighted there around, in some ways, there's almost a new division potentially emerging, which is those who work from home and those who work in the office. And then somewhere in between are those who are doing both. And I wondered, I think you mentioned when we were chatting that Nationwide have created some mechanisms to try and address that and sort of get people into the office. Is there anything you'd like to share about how that might be used to encourage people back in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that you actually ensure that people come in at least, either once a week or whatever. So there are places where you can come in and talk and actually, don't completely lose touch with your office. So you've got to think of mechanisms that will work, for people. Because I think what we're finding is that there's a gap between what people would like to do, what is actually good for them. Because in a way, I think people don't like the commute, they like the flexibility. But at the same time, I think that it's got to be highlighted than what they're losing out if they don't come in. So I think it's just a question of thinking of mechanisms, how you make sure you have systems whereby you encourage people at least to come, one day a week, or maybe once in two weeks and so on. So those are the sort of things which are being tried out, and as I say, this is a changing scenario, how it'll pan out. But I think there are mechanisms being put into place to make sure that you don't completely lose touch with your workplace. That there are opportunities for you to actually come into the office and manage. But I think this also has implications for people who are managing teams. How do you manage a hybrid team, and what skills will the line managers require to be able to manage hybrid teams and make sure that they work twice as hard to make that inclusion happens and nobody feels discriminated against. So I think it is a challenge really for leaders and managers in institutions. And I think that's an area where some work needs to be done in terms of how you develop those capabilities and sensitivities to be able to equip line managers.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, just might bring Neil in at this point, because I know, Neil, you've been looking at blended working, hybrid working, those kinds of things. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. Also, we're going to hear from Lucille as well about an FTA survey about returning to work. So perhaps, Neil, if you start us off with sharing any of your insights there, and then we can also pick it up with Lucille.
Well, I was going to chip in more around the sort of training aspect, because I mean, Lucille is basically leading on this for the FDA in terms of workplaces. My boss, basically. So I think if Lucille actually kicked off, it would work better, and then I can link in. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, we've been doing extensive work on it. I suppose as a trade union, we would always be looking at the persistent issues of inequality facing workers and how we can seek to transform and build inclusive cultures within employers. So it's always been on our radar. But I suppose, I mean, just thinking back really about the world pre-pandemic, I mean, it's sort of, it's quite interesting, isn't it, that I think, you know, a significant number of our members were dissatisfied with the world of work prior to lockdown in terms of, you know, there's the usual issues that you have in workplaces around unfairness in pay, barriers to promotion, those types of issues. But in terms of the world of work and what we're talking about in this context, you know, people were hot desking, they were hardly ever with their teams. If they didn't get into the office in time, then they were sitting alone and things like that. But also they had poor office space and workspaces anyway, combined with long commutes and long hours and presenteeism in that sense. So the world of work, whilst has sort of pivoted enormously in terms of the pandemic, I think this is a crucial point, and I absolutely agree with the points that Usha made of that, you know, it's a pivot point to re-engage with employers around the world of work, particularly around perhaps flexible working and how that will operate in the future. I mean, our experience was, whilst, for example, the civil service has more policies than you can shake a stick at, actually the reality for people on getting flexible working was very, very different. So just looking at, I mean, I just go into some of the detail of we did a survey of our members to sort of gauge where they were at in terms of the reopening up of the economy and all of that stuff. And we got a very high response, but it's very interesting. 94% of our members were not working more than 2 days a week from home before the pandemic. Now 92% are working from home pretty much permanently. So that is a critical piece of information. And also it chimes with earlier we did a working hours survey where it said, you know, most of the responses in that were 97% of our members wanted to work from home in some form going forward. So there's an interesting tie up there. But there's a lot said, isn't there, about whether people have been productive and so on. And it's very clear that productivity hasn't fallen. In fact, the civil service has delivered, in addition to the normal policy workloads, you know, the furlough scheme, the vaccine programme, Nightingale courts, you know, there's a lot of work gone on in the public sector, more than has been, I think, advocated by ministers and, you know, should be also advocated across the piece. But in showing that people have flipped to working from home and being as effective, it's really important that we don't move back to a new world of work that's as rigid as it was before. So it's interesting, but also contradictory. But 73% of our members think that working remotely has enabled them to strike a better work-life balance, which you wouldn't necessarily think that was the case. However, the counter side is that 45% found it more difficult to switch off. So there's an issue that we need to make sure that we pick up on that. However, 75% of the members felt just as engaged on the priorities and objectives of their department. And alongside that, though, 38% were keen to get back to the office to make connections and networks. And I think, again, I think Usha pointed to this, there is a real difference, isn't there, between, say, our younger civil servants who are in the fast stream, who are sharing their accommodation with several other people, haven't got their own space, versus people who have a set up office like I have and are privileged enough to be able to work remotely without that interference and stuff. I think we did experience that people are, so 49% felt that they were more isolated working from home, and 54% they felt that they can collaborate remotely and just as effectively. So there's some real interesting and mixed information within there. Interestingly, we asked if people felt trusted to work effectively from home, and they said pre-pandemic they felt there was 69% felt that they were trusted, but during the pandemic it rose to 92%. So there was something fundamental going on in that shift and cultural shift. However, people still felt that they were worried about their career progression. So I think there's a lot in there to unpack, and something that shouldn't be ignored by employers in terms of that way forward, and building on the good parts of people being able to work in different places, not necessarily from home, but in different places, but also enabling collaboration and like you say, that sense of belonging and an understanding of what the organisation needs and wants, as well as their own understanding in that sense. So, I mean, I can stop there, but I've got more, I suppose, information from the survey if you want me to carry on. But I think it's probably easier to stop there for now and then have a bit more of a conversation.
So I was going to chip in with a question, and then I might get Will's perspective on what we've discussed so far. But were you able, with the survey data, to analyse those responses by diversity demographics? Because I was really struck by the fact that you had, on the one hand, some people saying, well, I feel just as engaged as ever, or I feel more trusted to work, but then other people saying, it's hard to switch off, and I feel disconnected.
Yeah, we did do an analysis. I haven't got that necessarily to hand, but I think it was the differences in terms of being connected and so on was particularly younger workers, less so. I don't think there was a gender difference or a race difference. Actually, I think they were pretty uniform in terms of their responses. But I think definitely the young element was definitely a factor.
And I did wonder whether function made a difference as well. I've noticed in the private sector, at least, that those who are more eager to come back to the office tend to be those in sort of line roles, whereas perhaps support roles, they often expressed a preference to work remotely. And I wonder whether that had been reflected in what you found.
Yeah, I don't think we looked at it in that cross-function basis. I mean, it's something that we should look at. But I think anecdotally and from the conversations that we've had with members, I think that I would agree there are differences in terms of, particularly around seniority as well, and how navigating the hybrid working and how that's going to impact in terms of line management and so on, but also the impact of, having, ministers calling them back into the office to work, even though they were working remotely and so on and so forth. So I think there are definitely those strands that we would seek to address in terms of looking at the world going forward. Yeah.
And again, something I've noticed in the private sector may or may not play out in the public sector is perhaps those who have the privilege of being able to drive into work and park are less concerned about coming in than those who have to commute, because part of working in the office is you've got to get into the office, and if that involves a commute on a crowded train, that's often, a barrier to people who are uncomfortable doing that. And Neil, just you promised that you'd chip in any additional observations you had on what Lucille shared, so feel free to do that, and then I'll pick up with Will on what he thinks of what we've discussed so far.
And very briefly, really, because I'm aware there's two of us here from the FDA. I mean, certainly part of what I do, we offer training to our members, and we also offer out and work with employers and others. And what we've found is our unique selling point, if you like, which used to be that we provided primarily classroom-based training for people who, despite the area our union covers, we would target aspirancy, people aspirant to our union to develop them. And they couldn't get those opportunities. It was basically only members of our union at the senior civil service level. And that was the sort of feed into our union. What we're finding now is our unique selling point is interactivity and real-time training, because almost, I think there's a feeling amongst the people we interact with that offer is slipped back a bit. And you've got you've got remote learning, which is sometimes ticking a box, not actually engaging with anybody and looking at something. And who is that open to? We're talking about diversity. That's the whole point of this event. We are doing quite a lot working with civil service employers and networks to engage different groups of people from different types of diversity, whose perception certainly is that the training offered to themselves is still less advantageous than it is perhaps to other groups, and that really the ground has merely moved with the remote approach. So we're finding as a trade union, clearly we have to move as well, and we feel that we are, but there's a whole range of new challenges out there. And as to the question about whether the diversity questions are being addressed with this move, I think some of the evidence is we've got a long way to go yet.
I think one of the enigmas of this pandemic has been that the impacts it's created have been differential. So this split of some people saying this is the best thing that's ever happened. I love sitting in my back garden without the sound of aeroplanes flying overhead, and I had the time and the space to think. And other people saying I felt isolated and cut off, and we know the tremendous mental health impact of that. And then, as Neil said, then you've got to rethink, well, you're delivering your training. This debate about online training versus in-person has been going on for the long, pretty much since we ever had the ability to do online training, as far as I can remember. And some people love the in-classroom interaction. Others much prefer to be able to learn in their own time with micro-learnings that they do in their own time. And other people like the online ability to learn and join in with others because they don't have to commute in and do that. I think also, Neil, you highlighted that, new joiners in organizations, I mean, if you join the public sector, presumably your induction is going to take place online. And how do you develop a sense of what this organization is you're joining? How do you learn the culture? How do you sort of find out how to do things when every question you have has to be either, emailed or done by a chat to someone? So let's park some of those things, and I think Lucille will probably return to you for some more of the survey results, because it sounds like there's a lot we can unpack in that. But I wanted to give Will a chance to comment, because he's got a couple of decades worth of HR experience, and now you've had the benefit, Will, of hearing what Usha, Lucille and Neil have shared. We'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, thank you. Lucille, you have about 100 hours worth of discussion material in the 5 minutes of discussion there. So, we're not going to do justice to those topics, I think, even if we had a full day on this. I guess 2020, an unbelievable year of change for everybody the world over for a variety of different reasons. And like most organizations, we were predominantly a site-based, client-based, office-based workforce. And we had probably a couple of % of our people who were regular home workers. And even then, I'm sure at times they probably felt like they were home workers, actually really watching daytime TV and drinking cups of coffee and sort of walking the dog and knocking off at 2 to go and play golf. And it's fantastic that at least if nothing else has come out of the COVID crisis, that people now understand that working from home is not an easy option that other people thought it was. But we then changed within a very short period of time like everybody did, in order to keep the world turning. And you know, we haven't talked much yet about those employees who were key workers who never and still don't have the option of working flexibly. And I'm sure many people who are reading papers, watching television programs and commentaries about this are really fed up with hearing about this new way of working, flexible working, when actually it doesn't apply to them. They never had that choice. And even through the height of the pandemic, they were on public transport and making their way into workplaces in order to keep essential services going, whether that was in government or banking or whatever else it was, food or whatever. But we probably had about maybe 20% of our workforce fell in that category to varying levels over the first few months. But for the rest, it was this meteoric change. And like most organizations, we checked in with those employees directly through surveys and through increased contact. We actually saw our engagement levels increase last year, which is not uncommon amongst organizations, as I think people put more effort into communicating, engaging, and so on. And I guess the key thing that came out of all those surveys was that people are individuals. And we can talk about groups of people and we can talk about geographies and so on, but actually how the individual was impacted by that change in working practice and the extent to which that individual was interested in embracing those changes on a more permanent basis, which I guess is what we're talking about today, depends on the individual. And it depends on the circumstances. Some of those might be really practical issues round about the size of the place they live, who they share with, whether they had actually a place to work. We had people who, until we managed to get desks delivered, were working on ironing boards. We had people who were dialing into conference calls from their cars because there was the only place they could have peace and quiet. I mean, they weren't going anywhere. They were just sitting in their drive on the phone. And we had people whose circumstances were super challenging, people who were homeschooling, people who had caring responsibilities, people who were worried about their health or worried about the health of loved ones. And that was their primary focus. We had people who had money concerns, who were on furlough, and that was like, well, isn't furlough fantastic? Yes, but a massive readjustment financially for people and people real financial concerns. And also we had people who are just wired differently, right? I don't need physical interaction with people to be effective in my job. That's a personal thing. My boss, he's like a caged animal. He wants to go and he feeds off the energy of other people. He loves that interaction. And that's a very personal thing to do with how your own brain is wired, what you need from the workplace and what you don't. And we did some analysis of our feedback from our employees, and it wasn't, I expected there to be significant differences between gender, and actually there wasn't. The answers were fairly consistent. I absolutely expect there to be differences in age profiles, because all of the sort of media were saying that this is disproportionately affecting young people because of a variety of reasons. Actually, the appetite of people to embrace flexible working was actually pretty consistent in all age groups, which I was kind of interested by. It might well have changed by now. So I think for us, we had to bring this back to the individual. What does the individual want? Let's stop making assumptions about people. And actually, there is no shortcut. So in the last few months, we've been planning this for over a year about what the future of work might look like. And we've actually engaged with individuals and said, this is your role. As a company, we think this role could be done flexibly, but what do you want to do? And how does that manifest itself? And what would it take to enable you to do this role successfully in terms of physical stuff, but also the other things that we need to change culturally as an organization to make hybrid working? Because I think Usha is absolutely correct. The danger of creating another form of privilege, and we've been talking a lot about diversity and inclusion over the last year, particularly, thank goodness, finally, there's such a long way to go, but at least there's more energy there. And we talk about privilege in terms of education, or privilege in terms of family background, or social mobility, or skin color. And there's definitely a new emerging one, which is, presence privilege. Those people who have the ability to be based in an office if they want, and the sort of the hidden advantages and benefits that come along with that. And one of the things that I think has been fantastic over the last 18 months from an inclusion perspective is everybody's been in the same boat. You know, wherever you are based in the world, or which city you're in the UK, what level you're at in the organization, if you have a smartphone or whatever, you have the ability to engage with your organization on the same basis, exactly as we are doing in this call today. And people have embraced that really cleverly, I think, understanding how to engage and manage meetings and put hands up and use chat functions and feel included in the same way. And it's a really key worry of mine is that as people move back to some of the older ways of working, which people seem to think at with rose-tinted glasses, everybody was fantastic before COVID. Completely agree with you, Lucille, that wasn't the case. That actually we don't pay enough attention to people who are working in different ways of hybrid working and make them feel included. So that would be my quick summary.
And again, Will, you know, huge amount to unpack there. I mean, taking your last point, I have sometimes wondered, is the anxiety that appears to underlie some people's return to office connected with this awareness that actually they lack power, they lack influence in a physical way that other people have. And so, you know, the equalizing effect of everyone being remote is going to be lost. And I'll be competing again with people who've got privilege, people who've got presence, and I'll be forgotten again. I think for me, that's also associated with the visual aspect of diversity. You know, if you're online, you tend to only interact with your core team. And if your core team happens to be not very diverse, then the people you're surrounded with, in effect, you've lost a bit of diversity. And you learn diversity in the workplace, don't you? Because when you walk around, you see people who have visual diversity at least, and then you interact with them, but perhaps you learn some of the non-visual diversity. But I wanted to pick up something that you flagged and actually go back to Usha, because there was this idea you mentioned around culture, Will, there, and sort of what adjustments and assumptions are made about people coming into an organization. And it goes back really to some comments Usha made when we chatted before this session around the recruitment process and how often not much thought is given to induction. We put a lot of effort into sort of recruitment. We want to attract the best talents. But then when we induct those people into the organization, it's sort of disconnected from that recruitment process. And Usha, I wonder if you wanted to just pick up, pardon me, those comments you made around kind of what assumptions are made by organizations about culture and who is conforming to what culture, because I think that's something Will touched on.
Yeah. Before I comment on that, if I may just sort of pick up, I think some very rich contribution by Lucille and Will, because I think they've given a very graphic description of really how things really are. And I think what that points to is the word I used in my introduction is the empowerment of the employer, and I think this conversation that you're having in terms of, this is your job description, how would you like to work? I think that's the kind of interaction which is going to be very important. And I think Will is absolutely right that we do not want to create a different kind of discrimination of those who are able to come and feel they are privileged and those who are unable to come. And that also, I think, comes to in terms of, not only just recruitment and induction, because I think recruitment is going to become very important, because in a way, when you recruit people, this will mean that you will have to have these kind of conversations with people that you're recruiting. Because, I also said that hybrid working actually provides an opportunity to widen the pool from which you can recruit people. But similarly, I think when you're recruiting people, it really means that you will have to engage with them very carefully in terms of, having that initial conversation of empowering them so they know what is actually available for them and whether that opportunity suits them. So I think in that sense, recruitment will have to be looked at as well. And I think you're right about induction, because I feel quite strongly that, even in my experience, I think we are not very good now in terms of inducting people into the organization, because, you want different kind of perspective. But when you induct them, you really want them to become part of the organization and therefore do not really nurture the different perspectives people actually bring to the organization. And therefore, to me, induction is a kind of a two-way process where if you're bringing in new talent, you really need to think, what is it that they are bringing to the organization and how are you going to actually make sure they enrich the organization from that particular perspective. So the same will apply to induction, because in a way, I think even if people choose to work in a hybrid fashion, my vision is that they will have to have some part of induction in the organization itself. They'll have to come as part of the induction into the organization. And therefore, I think we would have to think very hard that whether it's induction, which is kind of an ongoing learning on both sides. And I think the kind of conversations that Bill was actually highlighting, I think need to take place on a regular basis. And I think induction, in my view, will have to be also underpinned by regular surveys of employees in terms of how they are feeling, how performance management is actually done. How do you equip managers to actually have these very open conversations, which are two-way empowering conversations. So I do want to underline the point, what I said in terms of line managers. This is a challenge for them in terms of how you will equip them, give them the capabilities to have these sort of empowering conversations. We can talk about it, but I think in reality, it's quite a big shift for people who are in line management. Therefore, we ought not to forget that. And I think they've got to learn, if I may use the term, how to manage this diversity in its broader sense and manage inclusion in its broader sense. And that's, I think, where the training focus needs to be.
I love that vision you've got, Usha, of induction being a learning opportunity for both sides. And it certainly in my experience, it feels a little bit lopsided. It feels like it's always been the learning is for the person coming in. The organization doesn't need to learn anything because we already know what we're doing. And, I think I shared with you that anecdote I have around SAP some years ago, decided to create a team that focused on giving opportunities to neurodiverse candidates to join and contribute to the organization. But what they learnt in that process was that it was going to require a change of culture at SAP for that to work. And to their credit, they were prepared to do that. Whereas I think many other organizations would say, oh, it'd be wonderful to have a team of neurodiverse people. Subtext, think of the amazing PR we're going to get out of this. And then, but of course, we're not going to change. Those people will have to conform to our culture. And it takes a very brave organization, doesn't it, to say, well, actually, if we're going to unlock the diversity you spoke about then, Usha, we may need to change. I think that it'd be great to come back to Lucille perhaps now and pick up some of those other things that have emerged from the survey. But there's one image that's going to stick in my mind out of the session so far, and I'm going to refer to this at the end of the day, I'm sure, is Will's view of what agile working might look like. Because we think about workplace of the future, we think about agile working, and, the idea of someone working on their ironing board or from a car parked under a tree somewhere, it's not quite what we imagined when we watched the Jetsons back in the day, was it? Where we were all going around in flying cars and, that agile working world of the future seems to be very different. So I'm going to invite Lucille, perhaps, if you've got another couple of aspects and dimensions of that survey that the FDA conducted, to unpack some of those for us, if you're up for that.
No,
by the way, sorry, Lucille, before you go, I do need to just remind people that questions are welcome. I did give you a slight, may have caused you slight confusion when I referred to the Q&A function. It's really the chat box you need to use. So have a look on screen. Put your comments in the chat if you have a question, and we'll get to that. We'd love to have your questions. But thank you, Lucille.
Yeah, I suppose the next bit was just building on what Usha and Will have just been talking about that trust balance. And it's really interesting, I think, because what I'm really pleased to hear that Will is looking at it from the individual perspective, but I think most employers will probably go to type on this because it will be it's difficult to navigate, and therefore they end up saying X amount of percentage of people have to be in. So our members said that 51% of them wanted the flexibility to manage when they're in the office and when they're at home, but also rather than having a set pattern of work in mostly at home or in the office or whatever that is. And it's really interesting how a lot of civil service employers have responded, and that's led by ministers in that sense. So I'm not blaming the employers, but they've suddenly gone to, well, you've got to be in the office 60% of the time. And it's like, really, where does that come from? And that's that cultural shift that we've got to get. And I think it was really strongly felt within the responses that we had from our members, is that they felt more empowered as being able to determine when they clocked off and when they didn't, and when they did their hours of work, and so on. And now it's sort of, well, actually you've got to be in the office 60% of the time, so that means I'm going to be commuting 3 or 4 days a week, and all of that stuff. So I think that's something we've really got to keep hold of and keep pushing employers to be more creative about how they are going to take the next steps in this journey. Because I think if it goes how I hope it's going to go, which is that flexible working practices and remote working practices become more accessible for everyone, then actually you can create a much more diverse workforce and a much better approach to how the work gets done, what the issues are. And obviously you've got to look at job design as well as technology. And I think Usha raised the point particularly about line managers struggling to not understand, but to learn how to manage differently in that hybrid working environment. But interestingly, a lot of our members were very worried about, so 57% were worried that their employer might introduce policies or technology to monitor their work. So there is that fear as well as a balance of power, but also, if you've been trusted to work remotely for nearly 2 years and then suddenly, we can't trust you anymore because we're now back into hybrid working. So I think that's a definite issue that we've got to talk to employers about and work through those issues. A very other interesting point that there's a lot of talk within the civil service and the levelling up agenda and places for growth, which are probably buzzwords, but it's all about moving outside of the Whitehall estate. But interestingly, when we asked a specific question about working from home or whether they would take a role that didn't allow flexible and remote working, 66% of members said they would turn down a promotion if that role didn't allow it. So again, that's something that employers really need to hear, because these are the people who they want to continue to employ and develop and grow. And if actually their interests are very different from what the employer's interests are, it doesn't take us very far. So I thought that was very interesting as well.
That's fascinating that the assumptions around the old model of work are perhaps being challenged now, aren't they? That come in, sort of do your time, climb the ladder, and it's all about the promotion. Whereas what you're saying, Lucille, is actually people are now taking a step back and saying, well, no, it's not just about the promotion. I want to know what flexibility I have in my working arrangements. And I guess what the pandemic has taught us is people are learning how to juggle childcare, caring responsibilities, management of household, commuting, personal safety, all of those things now, and they're part of the mix. And I do wonder whether what Usha, Will, Neil, Lucille, what you think about the idea that the redefinition of the workplace of the future is that the boundary between work and home is changing. In some cases breaking down, not least of which is we're all getting a look at everyone's bedrooms or sitting rooms or whatever and their family pets. But on the other hand, I do wonder whether anyone has got experience of perhaps intrusive employer demands, for example. Now, I know a number of people who are in the civil service, and they've said things like, well, I was expected to respond to something on a Sunday to get ready on Monday because there was a ministerial briefing required. And, previously that would have been unheard of, but now it seems okay. It's just assumed that you're going to sort of work 7 days a week. Is there kind of an assumption somewhere there that those boundaries between, when I walk out of the office door at 4 p.m. or 4:30, my day is done, but now there is no office door you're walking out of, you're just always available at the end of an email or a message. And I wonder whether that effect is playing out. Will, did you want to chip in any reactions? Yeah. And then I might ask Usha as well, and Neil, if you want to chip in anything further on what Lucille's just shared.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of really interesting points. I mean, first of all, this idea about attendance at the workplace. Okay, I live in Aberdeen. I have done for years. My wife and I, we made a personal decision that when we brought our children up, we wanted stability, and we were going to be in one place. So if I had to move for work, then that was fine. That's what I would do, but I'd commute. So for the last 12 years, I've commuted every week to London, which I hate. And why did I do that? When I took on the first CPO role in 2010, at that time, over 90 of the 100 FTSE businesses were based in London. And even if they were nominally based outside of London, their core team, their executive committee, were based in London. A very clear message: if you want to take on a CPO role for a FTSE 100 company, you have to be London based. That's it. There's no flexibility in that. And at that time, and let's not mistake, we've been talking about flexible working since I was at uni 30 years ago. And the process has been glacial. We've had barriers put in place about control of work, technology, security, client acceptance, and so on. That, as businesses, we've just sort of accepted them. Oh, okay, it must just be too hard. And, March 2020 blew that away within 2 weeks. If organizations wanted to survive, if services were going to continue to be provided, they had to find workarounds for this stuff to happen. Amazingly enough, the scales fell off people's eyes and they thought, wow, I actually can do this stuff in a different way, and the world will still keep turning. And the things that we thought were barriers, the technology and security and customers and so on, actually what we discovered afterwards is that those have been focused on the wrong things. And the risks with this change of working were things round about people's mental health or people's, other issues that people had. Some of them health issues because of COVID, but not because of that. So for me, it's been a fantastic test of some of those things. And at the core of these changes that some people are comfortable with now is trust. You either trust your people to do their job or you don't, right? Before I joined Capita, over 20 years in oil and gas, since the 1990s, my team have been spread all over the world. I wasn't physically supervising them. I can't. They're on West Coast Canada, they're East Coast Australia. I've always run virtual teams. So, for me, that's quite normal. But for other people, that change of being the boss, you go into premises, your team are physically around you, you can see what they do, what time they come into work, if they seem to be busy or not. And that's not trust. That's sort of very, very old school supervision. And I think what has to fill that vacuum is trust. You either trust your people or not. Now, the last 18 months, people the world over, my goodness, they have earned that trust. They have shown remarkable flexibility with everything that's being thrown at them, in that they've still been able to get their job done. So this needs to go beyond talking about workplace location and into a wider sense of flexibility. And part of that, again, goes back to employee choice. Why does somebody have to work particular hours? I don't. I haven't ever worked particular hours. And yet, why do we expect certain teams or certain roles to sort of be available at certain times? Now, of course, the exceptions, right? I want my pilot to turn up to work, and I want him to work on a plane. Right? He's no use to me at home. If I'm sick and I'm in hospital, I need a nurse to be on a shift. I don't want a nurse to be able to decide when they feel like coming into work or not. And there's lots of jobs like that. So this is not all encompassing, but for those roles that can be done flexibly, what is the issue? And for those organizations now saying, well, it should be 40%, 60%, why? For that role, if it's flexible or not.
Yeah.
And those people start saying, well, we think you should be able to come in once a week. Well, I'm not going to. I'm not going to fly down from Aberdeen to London just to be seen in a workplace to perform activities that could be done somewhere else. I will go anywhere in the world for a particular reason, for a meeting, for a required collaboration, for whatever it is, of course, I'm there. But why do I actually need to go somewhere else to perform activities that I know and have always known could be done more productively, more efficiently at home? And all the other benefits that we've touched on today that come with a more flexible approach towards work. We've got 1 million vacancies in this country right now. We are hurting ourselves as a country for an inability to fill those vacancies, but we still have unemployment black spots all over the UK with people that are desperate for work. We've got families that have had 4 generations of unemployment. So what is the issue with actually going and taking this different approach towards work and actually trying to get people back into the workplace in a meaningful way, do meaningful jobs that will give them purpose and financial security and all the rest of it? It's just madness.
Maybe that ties back to this thing we were talking about, you know, the willingness and ability of organizations to adapt both their culture and their ways of working. Because what you're describing reminds me a lot of, does anyone remember Dell computers? Not sure if they're still made nowadays, but they were pioneers back in the day of kind of mass customization, you know, and their model was, we build the computer after you've told us what you want. And it was very good for cash flow because it meant they got paid in effect before they'd spent the money, which is always good for business. And this mass customization model seems to be a potential feature of the workplace of the future where, as we've described, well, here's your role description. Now you tell us how that's going to work for you. How are you going to deliver that? How often will you be in? And you've highlighted that trust theme again, Will, where if I could just share a brief anecdote, you know, some months back, I mentioned in passing to my team on an informal virtual coffee chat that the effect of lockdown and working remotely was that I wasn't aware of what people were working on in my team day to day. And I meant it from the point of view that I had trouble understanding how busy they were. You know, that was really what I was trying to say. But the way I phrased it landed to them as, oh, he doesn't trust us because he doesn't know what we're doing and he thinks we're not working. And that's not what I meant at all. But it just made me realize, to Usha's point from earlier on, managers and leaders need to be aware of their impact and learn how to manage in a hybrid environment, how to even manage their language carefully so they don't create that impression. And I'm just wondering, you know, I'm going to also invite you to reflect on Lucille's comments now, but I just want to flag that we've got 2 questions in the pipeline coming up, so we'll be addressing those shortly. And the other thing is that as we close out this session closer to Q2, I'm going to be asking each of you to share one issue, one point that you'd like to leave our participants with today. So it could be an action point that they could take, or if you want to be provocative, you might leave them with a question or a provocation. So just be thinking about that now as we move towards the end, and we'll take those 2 questions shortly. But Usha, what did you take out of what Lucille shared from that survey?
I think I really wanted to underline the couple of comments which Will made. I think the word that crossed my mind when Lucille was talking was very much trust, because it's a question of how you're going to build trust. And the second question, I think, is also the question of honesty and integrity, because in a way they go hand in hand. And therefore, I think we probably will have to put a lot more emphasis on the value culture of the organization. You know, it's trust. And the third word that comes to mind is really flexibility, because, you know, it's a question of being flexible to be able to accommodate different ways of working if you really want the culture change. But I think what is going to be inevitable to some extent, it's reconciling, I think, different ways of working, the cultural shift, and matching it to the needs of the organization. You know, I mean, there will be inevitably what I would see, like to put it, as a creative tension there. And rather than lead to a kind of a bad law or bad practice, I think what will be needed is a lot more dialogue and discussion, and I think mutuality in terms of people really talking to each other. So that I think the words that, you know, I would like to emphasize, what is trust, integrity, honesty, the values and the culture of the organization. But I think how are you going to actually manage this inevitable creative tension Because I think the point that Lucille made about different ways and times of working, the flexibility means that people can choose to work the times that suits them, and that may match the needs of the organization. And at another time, I think people got to learn how to switch off their working at home. So I think there's a whole range of those issues which need to be, to be highlighted. But I don't think we should really underplay that in this process of transition, there's going to be quite a bit of, I hope it's a creative tension, out of which emerge some really good practices if we approach it in a very creative and responsive manner.
Mm. And, Lucille, the word that seems to have leapt out for both Will and Usha from what you shared, there was this thing around trust and how that's playing out. And it looks really interesting. I mean, if you'd sat down 2, 3, 4 years ago and sort of conceived the workforce of the future and what that might look like, I wonder how much of us would have paid attention to trust. Perhaps it wouldn't have featured very much. I don't know. Certainly going back a number of years, I was actually literally working on the workforce of the future in my role at KPMG, looking through a global lens at what that would look like. And we use personas to sort of investigate those. But it was very much around skills. It was around what skills would be needed and not needed. There was a bit about remote working and agility. But I don't think we ever really had the insight into that we've now got. And if we sat down and redesigned the workforce of the future now and did that kind of work, it would look very different. So before we take these questions, just a chance for Neil, if you wanted to chip in on anything that you wanted to observe on where we've got to so far.
Yeah, I was very interested in the conversation of the point you raised around the mix between work and the fact that we're all at home. What it sprang to mind was a conversation I had yesterday with another civil service union where we're going to be doing some work for them. They're actually going to cover that for us on a Saturday. Now, this is training about work that these folk don't feel that they can do during work time. And you might ask, what are unions doing, talking about offering training to the union's members on Saturday? It's a balance for us between giving them those skills. Our driver is they want more flexible careers, they want good things. But to get those good things, suddenly they're training on a Saturday. And there is a link there to feeling that you are constantly at work, you are working remotely, you can't get away. You've got the flexibility. Yes, it's a good thing. But there are some questions around diversity as well, and not just folk like me at the older end, maybe not so good at it as the younger ones, but also around whether we are making some of these adjustments and they're actually disadvantageous to people that would have adjustments if they're actually in the place of work. So to me, there's a real question mark here about making sure that we get the best use. It goes exactly to the survey, as Lucille was talking about, and there's some practical challenges there for us, I think.
Yeah. And obviously adjustments are one of the things that have come into highlight. I mean, in the old days, we used to measure, didn't we, the response time of the facilities team or whoever was responsible for this to provide reasonable adjustments in the workplace. Now it's what's a reasonable adjustment at home look like, and then how many pages of forms do you need to fill out to get those adjustments? And some organizations, I think, have just... Do you remember the old stationery cupboard debate? Do you lock your stationery cupboard or not? And they sort of found that if you just left it unlocked, then after a spike in stationery disappearing, it would then even out and people lost interest. A bit like working in a chocolate factory where you eat chocolate for about a week and then don't want to see it again in your life. And I wonder whether the adjustment thing there, and yeah, we've all been around the houses a bit on that probably. IT equipment, just come and help yourself to as many mice as you need versus having to fill out forms. So I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you now. The first one is as follows. I've started going back to my office environment 2 days a week. I've realized how much I've missed human interaction and connection. I'm currently feeling more organizational pressure to stay connected because I manage an operational function. This is not the same as other parts of the business. And I wonder how this will play out in terms of equity across the organization. So I think it's a great question because it brings up those points we mentioned around what's the impact of all of this on different functions. If you're in a support function or you've got an operational function, do you need to be there physically? I think Will mentioned it, you can't be a doctor from your living room, or well, you can to some degree, obviously, if you're doing remote diagnostic, but some roles just require people to be there physically. But then that sets up a sort of 2-track system that Usha mentioned of, those who are required to be in the office and those who aren't. perhaps some people get privilege from being in the office, but then other people feel it actually interferes with their work-life balance. So quite a rich question. Who would like to tackle that question? Anyone particularly keen to kick us off?
I'm happy to make a start, I think.
Thanks,
I mean, I suppose a lot of our members are managers and stuff, and we've sort of come across this a few times. I think, I think it goes back to some of the points we made earlier, is about what is the purpose of, I think Will covered it really well in terms of why have I got to be there and what am I doing when I'm there? And so I think for so long we've just, we've been office based and then just gone with, well, we've got this meeting and that meeting and I've got to be here, there and everywhere. Whereas I think actually what the new phases that we're going into is really, and it depends on the work culture, because you're going to have to be the one who asserts that actually I don't need to, yes, I've got an operational team, but I physically don't need to be there to make sure, to know that it's happening or to know that it's running, but I do need to be there for those team meetings or whatever it is. I mean, I don't know enough about the role, but there are certain points where as a manager you want to have face-to-face team meetings, or you'll want to have sessions with certain groups of your teams, which is much more is richer and more collaborative and able to pick up some of those nuances. I think the other side of it is, I'm desperate to be back in the office every now and again to meet up with colleagues, and like Will, I'm more like his line manager who thrives off conversations with people and meeting people face to face. But I think, getting the value out of why you're going into the office is the important point. I had a member yesterday saying that they'd spent 2 hours getting into the office, and then was not, because of, with all the COVID issues at the workplace and risk assessments and so on, they ended up just sitting at a desk on their own, and they couldn't collaborate with anybody apart from virtually. So I know that's a phase that we're going to be in for a little while, but actually, is that a good use of people's time, dragging them into an office where actually you're not doing what you need to do? So I suppose it's not necessarily the full answer, but I think those are the thinking that I would have around what is it that I'm trying to do when I'm in the office versus what is it what I can do from home remotely and have been doing for some time.
Yeah. And I mean, if your day ends up being full of online calls and you're doing them from the office, it does beg the question, well, what, and if no one else in your team is there and you're sitting alone on a desk just doing Zoom calls, you may as well be at home doing that and save the commute. And of course, I guess a lot of train services have been reduced, haven't they? So that commute becomes more fragile, because if anything goes wrong, and I've experienced this lately myself, train company, you know who I'm talking about. But if a train gets cancelled, it's not a matter of waiting 15 minutes for the next one. It could be 45 minutes nowadays because of the reduced timetables. Did anyone else want to chip in quickly on that one? Because I've actually had another question come in. So we've got 2 questions to deal with and 3 minutes left. Is anyone really, really burning to address that question that we just posed?
No, I think Lucille's handled that really well.
Thank you, Lucille. You've left everyone speechless. I guess for me, my response to that question was it does depend a bit on what you mean by staying connected, doesn't it? What exactly does the organization mean by we want you to be more connected? So the second question is a really good one and actually picks up what Usha mentioned earlier about AI. So this question is, we are surrounded more than ever by technology, AI and data. But going forward, how is the world of HR going to humanize the new hybrid way of working? What are some of the interventions that panelists can share? And Usha, are you happy to pick this up initially? Because you did raise this question of AI and robotics.
Yes, indeed, I did. I think the point we've got to remember with AI, it is not either or, it's how we're going to actually make sure that AI is used for the benefit of people, and how AI and people are going to actually collaborate. And of course, it poses a great deal of challenge for HR, because, the question is, it is about people. But there again is looking at your activities and saying, which will benefit from AI and which ones will not, and where human interaction will be very important. So my overall message is, it's not a threat, it's an opportunity again to look at, how you can use AI to increase the impact of what you do, but not lose the human touch.
And for me, this humanizing idea, I think there's an elephant in the room, Usha, when it comes to AI that we need to tackle and be honest about, which is the assumption that AI is bias-free, that somehow an algorithm, has no bias built into it. But we've learned that that's not the case.
Absolutely.
Algorithms are written by people, and they often carry that bias. And we've seen it show up with racial bias, with gender bias, all sorts. One little example is actually when they first created hand dryers, that we use in the toilet. They only activated when white skin was placed under them. If you were black and you tried to use one of those, the instructions in the machine said, switch on when you see this color skin. And, that's something we just didn't think about, but that's the way the scripts were written back in the day. Will, I'm going to throw this question at you because I think you're going to be good to tackle this one. If you don't, just let me know and I'll give it to someone else. So the third and final question is this. Research shows that we look more favorably on those whom we see more often. What does that mean for managers in newly hybrid setups? Can proximity bias lead to favoritism, and how do we combat this? I'm talking about having to be online or physically being in the office place.
Well, the proximity bias is already there, and it was long before COVID, and it was long before more flexible working practices. We in my previous organization, we had a presence in 40 countries, and we had a leadership team that was based in the UK because we were a UK FTSE listed company. And I would argue that those employees over the last 18 months have had the opportunity to feel a lot more engaged, a lot more access in terms of FaceTime than those people who just happen to be based in a head office. And this really annoys me. Like, I was at a conference a couple of months ago about the challenge of recreating water cooler moments. What an absolute nonsense. Water cooler moments are only effective if you happen to be at the same water cooler, on the same floor at the same time. And that, I tell you, is the minority typically of the people in your workforce, whatever your workforce is. So for me, I think I would flip that on its head and say there's a huge opportunity there to actually have meaningful FaceTime, even if it's over a screen rather than actually face-to-face, with people in different countries that have got things to contribute, views to share, to help shape your company. And that might mean they're in a different city or whatever, but these are people that often companies, they're the large forgotten people. And they have the same valuable ideas and inputs and right to be heard as everybody else. And for me, that's the fantastic opportunity that's come out of the last 18 months, that those people actually exist, not just the people who just happen to hang around in the same office as the bigwigs.
So we're coming to the end now, and I did promise to get each of you to share something. So in sort of 30 seconds each, what is the one takeaway you'd like to share with our participants? If you're ready to go, can you just launch forth for me with either a suggestion, an action, a challenge, or a question that you'd like to leave your today's participants with? Usha, perhaps start with you.
Yes. One of the things which I think is very important for us to reflect on, what have you learned about yourself during the COVID period by working hybridly? And therefore, what are the things that you would want to negotiate with your employer when you get back?
Great. Thank you. Lucille, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I think, I suppose I was going to say, how do you develop that trust between you and your line manager, or you and your team, and thinking about all the things that we've discussed and how you can hold on to the good and not just go back to that default, everything was like it was before, and we're just back into, that was a funny period of time, and now we're back to the next stage, as it were. So building that.
Thank you. Neil?
Yeah, I mean, I would think I would go back to basics really, and that when we're looking at the emergence into sort of different approach where we're linking the remote perhaps to a little bit of going back to work and so on, just to bear in mind the people that are designing those structures to address and properly look at and consult around the diversity issues, because certainly messages that we're getting through what I do from employer diversity networks is I feel that hasn't been happening. The assumption is that we talked earlier on about this being an equaliser up to a point. So I suppose the basic message is think around diversity and talk to the folk that can input to that when you're designing different approaches as things change.
And Will?
Yeah, I guess mine would be a challenge, which is, what are you personally or what are your organizations doing to use the new ways of working to change levels of diversity of thinking and, more importantly, inclusion in your organizations. There's a study came out last year that organizations that have diversity but no inclusion are less effective than organizations that have no diversity. So how are you going to use the new ways of working to meaningfully improve inclusion in your organization?
Lucille Thirlby, Neil Ryder, Will Serle, and Baroness Prashar, thank you for a fantastic session. We are now going to go to a networking break, and you'll be able to rejoin after that. Thank you so much.